All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Sam. I'm one of the co-founders of Fin Analytics. And I'm super excited to be here with Mary Winfield, who's been someone we've been talking to and we've been learning from for a long time now as we've kind of been figuring out this operations world, who's the former VP of Customer Experience and Trust at Lyft, was VP of Global Technical Services at Sophos, and was the CCO for Small Business Consumer Care at Intuit. And so Mary, thank you for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, no, super excited to be here. Thanks,
It's
Sam.
you're one of the people I feel like I've really been learning a lot about the operations world from. And so again, it's great to have you joining. So there's a bunch of topics that we kind of brainstormed that I think would be pretty interesting to people, especially as we're kind of figuring out this whole brave new world of what just happened, right, on the operations side. There's a lot of trends that were already happening that just kind of got really both accelerated or changed pretty dramatically by this kind of period of work from home and the changing environment. So, I mean, I'm kind of curious to start by just kind of going through a bunch of those with you and talking a little bit like, what are really the biggest trends in your mind, either that were already there or that were just like massively accelerated around how smart companies are approaching optimizing operations work?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The first for me is really simplification. So I think what's been coming around for a long time now is how complicated systems and tools are at an operations level.
Yeah.
I think, if you sat down with an associate in many companies, they've got probably anywhere from, 10 to 20 tools that they access to be able to problem solve. And so I think in the past 5 or 6 years, I think simplification has been a big theme, just because of the complexity. I think we design a bunch of stuff and push it out, not really linking that end to end of the systems.
And can I ask you a little bit of the history of this? Because I'm actually pretty curious. So like, how did we end up, I mean, this has been a thing that we kind of noticed early on in the Fin journey, and we were kind of shocked by it. It actually caused us to build a lot of what has become Fin Analytics. But like, how did we end up in a place where like a person is managing 20 different tools? Was it always that way? Was it like how did that balloon?
No, I think we've gone from famine to feast, right? So it was, I've been doing this now for probably 20 years, from product management and continuous improvement into kind of frontline and operational work. And so, 10, 15 years ago, it was one thing. It was a spreadsheet people were using on a front line. It was a Word doc. It was that kind of thing. And then I think with the explosion of tools and technology, apps, all kinds of different things over the past probably 10 to 15 years, a lot of that got really complicated at the front line. And I think the root cause for me, as I look at it, is we tend to move away from that customer and employee experience, and we design a bunch of stuff in conference rooms.
Yeah.
And so as you're doing that, you really don't know kind of that day to day, what are the workarounds, what's happening, what's needed. And so, somebody comes to you and say, oh, we've got this magic tool that's going to allow your frontline to do X, Y, or Z. And what I've seen is many companies don't even include their operations teams in those decisions.
Yeah.
And so it's just one more tool to try and incorporate or paperclip together to what they're trying to do.
So you end up with like all this like tool explosion. I guess part of the problem is no one is really getting paid directly to simplify.
Correct.
Right? Like people are getting paid to like solve a specific problem, or they're told we need, the knowledge base isn't good, so someone goes and buys another knowledge base, right? But no one is getting paid. Now, is that, I mean, like I always kind of, and tell me if you think I'm overreaching here, but always go back to like, well, this is a measurement problem, right? It's basically because people like, the reason this happened is because people are almost being incentivized on the wrong things.
What you measure is what you get, right? What you measure is what you get. It's just kind of human nature. You set a goal, you set a measurement, and that's what people focus on. I think some companies have worked through it through kind of employee engagement.
Yeah.
Right. And so as you see more companies getting to kind of outcome measures, they've started to realize they're not meeting those, and then they have to work backwards. Right. So the why of that.
Yeah. And I guess the other question is like, so the outcome measurement has evolved a lot in the last few years, right? Like that kind of, I mean, when I started my career, not that I was super connected to this, but I remember I was at Bain and Company, and like Bain's like NPS analysis, this is like a long 15
Yep.
years ago, was just like that they were pushing it so hard and it was like brand new. Now it's kind of everywhere and been modified 1,000 times over, right? And kind of led to some stuff. Like what are the other like key things that you think have like changed either in terms of outcome measurement or things that like are changing how people are approaching this kind of like explosion of tools and like where we go from here?
Yeah, I think, the outcome measure, I think, it moved from CSAT to NPS to, do we love you? It's all those kind of things. And I think it has its place, right? You can understand the outcome. Did it deliver what I wanted it to deliver?
Yeah.
And I think many companies get stuck on that. And the reason why is you really have to dig underneath it
Yeah.
to get at why was one good and one bad, right? On the outcome, whatever the outcome measure is that you're choosing. And I think, it's basic kind of process management 101, right? You have inputs, you have process measures, and you have output measures.
Yep.
And I think you have to be able to look at those holistically to really get at root cause. And many companies, they just post that outcome measure, right? And so what you see, I think also that's impacting this is over the past, I'd say probably 10 years, employee engagement has become a big focus for many companies. And so again,
Can I ask a question? Like, why? Like, is it because employees are like expensive to recruit, and like labor markets have been tight, so it's been like economically important to like engage employees, or are there other reasons that it's become kind of the key thing?
I think that is a primary. I also think folks kind of through puzzling through these outcome measures have really at a high level, you kind of get it intuitively, which is, if I'm using a computer, say, to deliver this outcome, and the computer's not working well, or it's sluggish or whatever, you're going to get a worse outcome. And I think many companies, just even from an efficiency perspective, look at employees and say, I want the best, right?
Yeah.
I want somebody that's going to do the great job, right? And so then you start to scratch underneath that of how do I get great employees, right? I hire them, and then to your point, then I start to see people attriting, or I start to see, the numbers going down. And so then I've really got to start to dig into care about that person and understand what is getting in their way of delivering great outcomes.
Yeah, so it's like basically you kind of went from like first let's figure out the customer side. It's like, are they happy? Are they getting what they want? Now, whether they're happy and whether there's lots of ways to make someone happy, it's a terrible business decision, right? Like the good old example of like everyone's going to give you a great NPS score if you just give them tons of free credits. It's not necessarily the right thing for the business, right? Then there's like, okay, well, let's measure the internal side or the employee side, which is the key input to all of this, right? And like if they're happy and feeling fulfilled, we're probably not asking them to do a bunch of rote terrible work that, or we're asking them to switch up. There's signal in that. And like that might help with this kind of tool explosion or whatever, things like that. And then I guess there's the other thing which you mentioned, which I guess I'll self-servingly push on for a second, which is just like the actual process measurement, which, when you're on a piece of paper in a Word document is basically impossible, right? Like you don't know what people are doing. You have no record keeping of it. The second you're in digital applications, in theory, it should be more measurable. But in practice, it really hasn't been because it's been all over the place, right?
Well, I also think we haven't held folks accountable to the process measures. We keep kind of going to that output measure as the simple dashboard of success.
Yeah.
And, we have some kind of tolerance around that of not really wanting to get into the details of the process or the inputs that are coming in.
And like, is that just, like, why did that happen? Because if you think about it again, like, this idea that we should care about the process. Let me put it this way. In my experience with operations teams, there's always this huge tension between like the line managers and the teams and the people working on like process and tools, right? Because the process and tools people are like think that the teams are not good, and the teams people like think that the process and tools, there's this like massive like, and I've just like I've never not seen this on some level. Like some teams are better, some teams are worse, and it just seems like obviously the answer is to measure the process and then find the gaps. But it's kind of shocking to me in getting into this world that like really hasn't happened yet, or is just happening now. I'd like to think that we're like one of the companies doing it. But like, how did we, I mean, you have such a history in the space. Like, how did this take so long to become a thing?
Yeah, I think a big piece of it is out of sight, out of mind. So if you look at most companies, right, their core of power is usually product or sales, right? And so in that, we've really, years ago, streamlined the sales process, made it more productive, all of those kind of things, the product management process. And so I think for many companies for years, right, the front line or operations was an expense to manage. It wasn't something to optimize. And so I think with going at these outcome measures and understanding delight, many people are working their way backwards to understand, oh my gosh, I gotta have, talented and engaged employees. I've gotta really click down into the use cases that are being managed through my operations team. And, it was probably 15, 20 years ago, was working with Jenny Lee over at Intuit. And we were in that same space of it was all generalized. And so we were trying to lead an operations team. And the critical thing that she did and I worked with her on was what we called staple yourself to an order. Mm-hmm. And so we took kind of that leadership team and the process improvement folks from the technical side, and we took them through an experience of they had to staple themselves to a bunch of orders and flow through the process and kind of experience what was happening.
Yeah.
And I think that out of sight, out of mind, we've never really over the years clicked down into the actual use cases that are being run through at a case by case level.
I think that actually is an interesting thing you bring up. And I've noticed this too in the work we've done, which is one of the problems is everyone likes this idea of even like, I need to shadow a case all the way through to understand it. But there's two big problems I found like trying to do this manually. One is it's really tedious. So like even really great people who really want to do a good job, when you're like that kind of, I'm actually kind of curious, and you like staple yourself to orders, like it's really hard to actually do because you're on, then there's a pause, then you're waiting. Like if you've ever actually, I mean, and you've done this, I'm sure way more than I have, but like shadowing operations agents manually is really difficult to focus on doing. Right. At least I've found, just because, it's very slow. Right.
It is slow. I think what I've seen in the past probably 5 years or so is, especially in kind of startups and higher growth companies, you have a lot of founders, no different than yourself, right? With Finn, where, on any given day, you could be chief bottle washer to HR leader to whatever that might look like. And so what I've found is for many companies, it's easier because a lot of that founding team had to do this operational work. And so, and I think that's the trick. For many companies, they were older and established and they had to come back to this.
Yeah.
And then for many of the newer companies now, it's that space of not losing sight of where they came from, right? Yeah. And what they know and understand.
Which is super hard to do because things change really fast. Yep. And like the second you're not doing it all the time, you lose context so quickly, right?
Yeah, we built a team with Lyft. We had a whole process team. And so I made trade-offs early to build process improvement and process focused teams within the operations groups. And so I think it's harder when you try to have them come from outside the organization.
Yeah.
But to your point, there's friction. There's always friction, like of the, no, you didn't do it right. No, you did, it wasn't designed the right way. Oh no, you're not implementing it the right way. But I think when you're on the same team, focused on the same measures and dashboard and things like that, you work through it. You have to kind of get to that space of really getting at what's actually happening on a regular basis.
Well, it's also just interesting because I think it's like so easy, which I think is maybe the pitfall that people who have grown up in the operations side have sometimes, which is you know your own experience, but not necessarily what's happening in a big picture perspective, right?
Oh my gosh, it's
and
always
so
the beach
you end up
ball,
arguing
right?
from like your very small purview, where you're like, well, I experienced this, so this is true, and you're like, well, actually, that's not true, right? Like you just happen to, because you only get so many reps of looking at a specific thing. I mean, it's kind of like, again, I mean, you know this, but part of what's I think drawn us to working on fin analytics and having this like quantitative plus qualitative intersection where you have the full data picture and then you use that to click into specific experiences and replay them and whatever, is just like, you know, you're either coming from a landscape experience and you don't actually know what the tools feel like, or you're coming from like, I am an operations person, I grew up and like I have that, but you're missing the forest from the trees because you're trying to fix click number 7 on page 3, but it's like 1% of the problem, and there's like a huge thing, you know, you haven't seen, right?
Well, and I think humans naturally, some people are really good at the strategic, at the higher level, the generalized. And then some people like kind of own a sliver and be in the belly of the beast and understand it really well, but can't see the context from the broader. So, and I think that's what leadership's about, Sam. I mean, that is the point of leadership, is to be able to, you know, it's that beach ball, the old beach ball, and you're looking at it and you say, what color? Somebody's got a panel that's red and yours is blue, and you keep saying, no, the ball's blue, right? And so I think as leaders, it's our job to kind of pull back and zone in, and, you know, that pulling back and using the analytics and the data around the process measures and the input measures gives you directionally, you know, it's the needle in the haystack and how to get to it.
So Mary, I want to like make the problem even more complicated from like a place you have a lot of experience, which is like, when we're talking about this, like the reality is we're talking as though it's all your team in your house. Now that's not actually how most operations teams, once they're kind of growing, actually work, right? Like usually you have subcontractors and BPOs and other groups, and like I'm very curious, and now with COVID you also have remote teams. So when we take everything we just talked about and make it even more complicated by saying, well, you know, you're actually managing through other organizations. I'm curious, and I think people on the call would be curious to hear a little bit your viewpoints on how do you do that well? What are kind of some of the do's and don'ts? How do you start thinking about these same principles, but with this added layer of indirection?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, you know, the core for me is you always have to own something before you can give it to somebody else. And so I think sometimes we lose sight of, you know, something's really core to the business or it's complicated. And instead of figuring that out and simplifying it, we hand it over to somebody and say, please deliver this outcome on this work. And we don't even understand the work.
Yeah.
And so I think it always has to start at some form of, you know, do you own and understand what you're allowing other people to do on your behalf in a way that you can manage it from afar or through other companies. Yeah. And so I think for many companies over the years, I've seen, you know, oh, it's an efficiency plan. I'm just handing this to somebody, and they don't even understand the work that they're giving out and what it's capable of doing in its base state. So much less how to optimize it.
So that, I guess that'd be the first thing, is just like literally just make sure that you have an internal sense that you trust of what like the best case is, or the case that you were able to achieve, and then benchmark them against yourself. What about having multiple vendors benchmarking against each other or things like that?
Well, and I think it was taboo for the longest time, right? It was this space of, I'm going to have this relationship with this one vendor, and if I have 4 or 5, I'm going to have a separate relationship. And so what I probably did, you know, 10 years ago now, is remove those barriers. And so I think it's really important to have transparency of the work and the measures and all of it across partners. And so in many cases, I think it's important to, have a champion challenger kind of thing that's going on where there's one dashboard and everybody can see how each partner's performing. And you are able to say, gosh, I'm giving, partner A and B these 3 use cases, right? And I'm going to share a dashboard on what that looks like. And whoever's doing it better, I'm going to give more work to over time, right? Whoever's helping me to optimize that process. And so I think, it's really critical that you don't partition those things and you have a really transparent set of measures that you're looking at for everybody.
And just to kind of keep going, I mean, when you do champion challenger, do you ever work with like one vendor and have multiple teams inside that vendor competing? And then how do you think about like those dashboards, just to ask 2 questions at once? Why not? Like, how do you think like those dashboards and how you design them? Is that a thing that you come to them with, or is it like a co-evolution process, or like, how do you think about
I think it's important to be co-evolution, right? But you also, if you're wanting, I'm just picking something like an output measure of net promoter, and you pick a partner who's never done anything around net promoter, right? Shame on you, right? I mean, you've got to start the relationship around shared expectations of kind of measures and performance. And then I think it's super important that you build that and transform it together over time. So, right, you'll learn, you'll be able to give feedback. And I think, the teams that I've led, it's important to make sure that we're having that level of detail at least 2 or 3 times a year, where we're saying, gosh, is this getting us what we wanted to accomplish? And then what else should we be looking at? Or maybe we need to change the measure or change the reward.
And then I guess the question, so when you think about those analytics and those dashboards you're building, like I totally get how NPS is a thing or things like these outcomes, and again, this is a little bit self-referential, but why not? Like when you go into, you want to understand the actual process being run at these different BPOs and start actually having the conversation, not just about, well, this is the NPS you achieved and this is the NPS you achieved, but like, well, how? Like, how do you, I mean, are companies doing that? I mean, self-servingly, I'm like, well, that's what people should be using things like our software for. But like, what are people doing? Are people doing any of it? How are they approaching it? And how do you get to like the next level of effectively, this continuous performance improvement bake-off thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's not a lot of companies, but I think the leading edge of this is really to engage every employee as if they're your employee. Right. So, right, there's a space of whether they're being run by a different manager or a different company or anything along those lines. How do you get really clear that you're treating and measuring everybody the same and have that same level of transparency? I also think the leading edge of this is to allow those that aren't part of your company, if you're treating them as if they're your employee, they need to have a voice back into the system. And so, right. And part of that, I think I was watching a TED Talk a couple days ago, and it was Susan David. She's from Harvard and does a lot of work. And she made this comment that was sticking with me. And she said, the beginning of moving towards a better life starts with showing up to the pain of our experience. And she does that from the individual psychological perspective, but I think it's so applicable to process, right? And to anybody. And I think we have these faulty barriers that we put in place when we partner with other companies as if we treat them different. We don't allow them to share that pain or to join us in collaborating around fixing it. And I think you can't get to trust if you don't have feedback, right? If I can't give feedback, I'm not going to show up for you if you can't listen to me or hear me around my pain.
No, I think this is like one of those things where like I think we're in this weird place where to some degree it feels like, at least in some corners, people fear the transparency. But it just seems to me like the only way to get to better overall outcomes for everyone is to your point, share the pain, share the success, be clear and transparent, right?
Well, and I think that's another trend, and it's something I focus on is, there's reward in experiences. And so
Yeah.
do you share the reward with your partner in the same way that you do the pain, right? So I think we tend to be really punitive with, partner relationships, but I think it has to be, you share in the downside as well as the upside.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, like better data and insights give you the ability to do that. Because I mean, it is kind of one of those things where you think about the most simplistic level and you're just like, look, all I know is that this customer is mad and that you talk to them. Then all you're ever going to do is be angry in those cases and there's no upside on it, right? Now with things like NPS and CSAT, you can be like, well, you did, this customer's really happy. Like there's upside in that, right? But that doesn't actually speak to the business goals necessarily, the process, the efficiency, right? Like, and there is a world in which you're like, yeah, I mean, the more a future world where, partners can go at risk with you effectively, right? And good partners can do really well, right? Is a new world that you could get to with better data and better shared incentives and better shared pain in a lot of ways, right?
Well, and I think, looking at like kind of when we started talking, I love the ability to get to the very micro level, and that is human by human.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not from a punitive, I'm going to go beat you up perspective, right?
Yeah.
It's from the perspective of a range, right? And if I can see there's 100, associates doing this work, and I can compare them, I can start to understand, you can get at that needle in the haystack, being able to look at that range of outcomes that you're getting around the same experience and start to, see what are the best associates doing, what are the worst. And it's not about beating up that person. It's about understanding, many cases I would find, somebody didn't get the same training as somebody else. Right. And so my partner site is performing lower and they've never been able to access the key database they need to deliver for the customer. Right.
Totally.
And so you can start to unpack that and really analyze at a level to take action that's going to move that outcome in a greater level.
Yeah, I mean, a good example that comes up to mind immediately, I think that is like we've just kind of started to really internalize in the data how critical management is. Shocker, right? But like, you know what I mean? It's one of those things where you're like, in the end of the day, if you're an operations team and you have all of your scores and they're lined up by person, you're like, this person delivered this score, this person, and you're like, wow, these people aren't doing very well, right? And you're like, those people must not be good. And you're like, wait a minute, all those people report to the same person, right? And you're like, wow, this person's not getting the QA they need, they're not getting the coaching, they're not getting the feedback. You start to actually see the data, right? When you start looking at
the power, Sam, I found on the true cutting edge of this is when that is so transparent to a team that they are self-correcting.
Yeah.
Right. And so I've seen it where when teams are allowed to own that and have feedback and control their own destiny, right? You'll see an employee that is the lowest and maybe it is a motivation or an attitude kind of thing. And you'll watch a team like go and fix that themselves. Right. And so like, there's no need at that point. That is when it's truly working, is when you have so much transparency that the team wants that data so that they can improve, not so you can tell them to go improve.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I'll give you another kind of anecdote on that, which is funny, which is because of our tools, we obviously have instrumentation on every single operations agent in every single moment and what they're doing by case, and you can use that. But we also have all the instrumentation by line manager to understand how much time are they spending reviewing videos and QA, like how much time are they spending, annotating things. And what was shocking to us when we started doing this is just this incredible variation. I mean, we knew there was a variation. Everyone kind of gets that there's a variation in agent performance, but like, you don't really think that there's also massive variation in the work style and the performance of the managers, which actually has more of a net impact on the overall system than almost anything else, right?
Oh my gosh, it's so true. And Sam, I think most people at a management or a team lead manager level think that they have gotten to some level where there is no process.
Right.
Right. And so I'm now a manager. There's like, I can see really good managers that are honing their process, learning from others. they've looking for like, what do great managers do? How do we think about management in our company? What does that look like? But I think for many, like the historical in most companies is, I'm now a leader. I don't have to follow a process, right? There is no best practice. I'm just so good. I'm going to show up however I want to. And you get so much inconsistency in that at management.
Right. And that I think is kind of the interesting, this is obviously a long-term thing, but kind of why I'm like very dogmatic that we will get to a point where everyone who's a knowledge worker is going to want continuous measurement, because without it, they won't be able to improve and they'll understand that relationship. It's like being a baseball player and not having instant replay or stats.
Or
right?
stats.
You need it, and it'll get to the point where like I kind of envision a not too distant future world where, you're a knowledge worker, and if there's a job that you're applying for and there's no measurement of your process, you're going to like not want it, right? Like you're going to, and like I think that'll happen even sooner in the BPO world, where they're like, look, if you're not measuring my process, I don't want to work with you, because I don't want to be held accountable to just your random NPS score.
Well, and I think that's the space that I don't think most people are conscious of yet at a leadership or a, executive level, is talent is your operational talent. The better the talent is going to have real criteria around what they get to do their work, right?
Yeah.
And to your point, there'll be a space where people are like, I'm interviewing you.
Yeah.
Right. I'm interviewing you to see, do you get this? Do you understand enough to enable me? Or am I going to be in a place where I'm, rolling a rock up a hill?
Totally. So there'll be a world not too distant future. I'm wondering if this is happening already. I mean, have you seen BPOs or people, service organizations that are like, we don't want to take on work until you've done it yourself? Has that happened yet? Or is everyone so hungry for business, they'll take whatever comes?
I think it's a mix of that. I think it depends on, the individual as well, right? I mean, once you gain consciousness of operating in a space with that kind of measurement, it's hard to accept anything else.
Yeah.
Right. And so many times I think people will accept whatever because, people are hungry for work or whatever that might be, or it's a named company. Right. And so I think sometimes the company brand can like wash over that. And some of the best brands don't have that level of insight or enabling for their operational folks. And so you see them burn through folks pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But I think once you're, a manager or a frontline operations person or anyone in operations, and you've experienced that level of transparency, you will demand it wherever you go. And if you don't have it, you're going to work towards it.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. So what about the remote work stuff? So you've just witnessed with COVID, both operations like BPOs, et cetera, going remote, as well as obviously all these first party teams. First of all, I mean, anything surprising to you about what's shaken out of that? And then two, I'm kind of curious what you think will come from there. But I'm just kind of curious. I mean, you've been studying this. I know everyone's been thinking about remote work, but there hasn't been as much of it. And now we just got flooded with it. Like, what was surprising?
So what's surprising to me is it's taken so long to get to this. I have never found a home-based or work-from-home group that isn't more productive than an office-based. And so anytime I've measured that over the past 10 years when I've had remote teams, what I find, or work-from-home teams, is that they are more productive. And it's counterintuitive to the narrative that has been created around efficiency and effectiveness, right? There's some space where people believe, oh, you're home, you're distracted, you're not productive, it's so difficult, it's all those things. Every time we've done this and compared it, the home-based crew is more productive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, especially when you're dealing with more complexity or more emotional content, right? I also sit on the board for the hotline for domestic violence. And so you can imagine those calls are pretty emotional and difficult to deal with. Having a trust and safety team, right, is the same. And I think there's something about somebody not having to commute and do and all this to be able to deal with that level of complexity in their home-based environment that's critical. I think what I've seen and what I think is going to get in the way pretty quickly is you have to design it, right?
Yeah.
There has to be a criteria by which somebody is able to work from their home, right? And so that could be, distractions, right? It's not, you don't want somebody who's got 6 roommates and is in their living room, right, working from home kind of thing. And so you really want to design and learn what the best practices are for what is a home-based office. What does that look like? What's time on, off, those kind of things, and be able to share that as a clear expectation versus just saying, go work from home.
Yeah.
And so I think we're in a space where those that design it will have a lot of success with it, and those that don't will end up in a frictious place around kind of not being able to get to the productivity that they want.
So it's interesting. So you think that, and so, I mean, everyone just kind of sent all their people home. Some of them are coming back. I'm kind of curious, do you have an over under on like what percentage or how to think about who's going to stay at home now that they've seen it, like in this last 2-month period versus kind of re-pull everyone back into offices?
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine a product team member in the Valley being able to pull people back into offices on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I can't. There's a expectation, I think you'll see folks that are not kind of frontline that will demand that as part of, kind of their package for what they're dealing with. But I also think as you think about frontline work, that the historical answer has been, you're not as productive. It can't be done. Oh, we don't have the systems and tools to do it, right? All of that. So I think there's a whole piece of roadblocks that got taken out of the way pretty quickly with COVID, and because it was a forced situation. And so many people had to go figure out how to do this, right? How to make this happen, even for operations and frontline employees. And so I would assume that there's probably 25 to 30% that won't go back. And then there'll be a whole portion where folks think they can move it back, but they won't be able to move it back fully. It'll be I work from home 2 days a week or something along those lines.
What about like the BPOs? Like there's obviously BPOs that have done remote work versus ones that have all been centralized, and security concerns around that. But I'm kind of curious, like what do you think is going to happen there?
I just lost you on the video.
You can hear me though, right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. I'm back.
I think that what I've seen, the better outsourcers, the better BPOs are really getting at what does it take to get to the best talent.
Yeah.
And a key criteria of that is some bit of home-based work, either fully or not. What we've also found is there's populations, I think that many BPOs and some companies, I know like we were at Lyft and at Intuit, where there are populations who are home-based. Think about military spouses, right? Highly educated, highly motivated folks who have to move a lot or, need that home-based kind of environment. And so I think you see probably there's a good 20% of them that are looking at this as a model and have done this or doing more of it because it's such an engagement tool and because they get at talent that they wouldn't normally get at.
Yeah. Do you think I'm just saying this is kind of off the cuff, but like, do you think there are going to be new BPOs or entrants into the whole market that are going to be remote only? I mean, there obviously are those already.
Yeah,
do you think it's going to actually change the market?
Yep, there's a couple. And I think that's what you see some of the larger ones trying to kind of catch up to is what and how and what type. I think especially in the technical space, the technology space, you see a lot of that for kind of outsourced frontline to be at populations that wouldn't normally want to come into an office to work.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Interesting. So I guess, I mean, I don't want to.
Yeah, you could go disrupt the whole space, I think. I think it's
why not?
ripe for disruption.
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting because you just imagine a world, and I'm just trying to like forecast where state of the art is today and where it's going to be, right? And like, I mean, you and I obviously are kind of talking our own books and agree on this, but there's to some degree, like, we're going to need deep process measurement, and people are going to demand it. And organizations that have it, right, and are having transparency around it are going to be able to build better tools and have better employee engagement and better BPO relationships and the whole 9 yards. Like, I think that's...
Well, Sam, I think if we could look at, high growth companies, if you were to do some kind of measure like they did at Bain back in the day on Net Promoter, and the companies that were using Net Promoter, what their growth and their revenue and all that was, I think if you looked at it now, if you could see the companies that were at process level measures, you would see that same kind of data. You'd see it. It's that second wave of what's happening to really take it to the next level of delivering delight.
Totally. So that, I mean, we agree on that, and I think that's really interesting. And then one thing is interesting is in terms of managing BPOs down to the team level, I think this like shared creation of goals and incentives and shared upside is like a really interesting business model evolution, right? Where it's really not just churn and burn tasks, right? It's look, like, this is the outcomes we need. This is best practice. We don't want to just be whacking you when like something goes wrong, but like, here's kind of the opportunity. And ideally that works partially because you actually can undervalue the work. Like, you actually know from a company value perspective, not just, oh, you did a bad job and that's bad, so you should do, but like, look, if you do a good job, this is how much it's worth to us, and there's shared upside on it is like a huge evolution. And then the remote thing is a huge evolution too, right? Where all of a sudden, you can think of it as a talent game globally, right? Rather than just, plopping down a center and trying to like keep people in that local area engaged for whatever margin you can get, right?
Well, I also think the disruption will come from, the hours worked, right? Yeah. So you think about I've been living in the gig economy for 6 or 7 years now. You'll also see a demand no different than work from home of, I want to work the hours I want to work.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a musician. I'm building my own small business. I want to supplement. Right. And so again, I think for BPOs and for companies, if you can get to that flexibility of schedule, right? And so, I think the best are looking at, when do I need somebody?
Yeah.
Right. And so being able to lay out, and I think, your tools help do that as well. What's my peak times, right? What's happening around this use case, and when do we get these calls, and what does that look like? If you can get to that, you can say, oh gosh, I've got 4 hours of work a day for one person, 3 days a week, or whatever that looks like. And you can lean into the flexibility that this higher caliber talent wants as well.
No question. I mean, the hour flexibility thing, some of the companies I have insight into has been it's a huge efficiency driver and happiness driver for teams, right? Because again, once you work from home, look, we know we have a morning peak and an afternoon peak and nothing's happening in the middle of the day. And so,
take a break,
take it off, and we'll pay you more for the actual hours you're working because that's what matters to us, right? Like, there's an interesting...
You can pay more money, you can increase the salary, you can do those kind of things because you aren't like peanut buttering your spend across a day.
So that's powerful. I mean, I think the other thing with flexible work and gig work though, which I'm still kind of like, I'm curious how you think about it, is there is this training problem, right? Like, in theory, jobs that can be so abstracted, right, into a like click a button, you need no training to do them, they're not very good jobs, and like they're usually the most automatable. Whereas like what we're talking about, these types of more sophisticated things, like you can't train someone who's only going to work 3 hours, you know what I mean? Like randomly, right?
Well, so I think what you have to do, and what I've learned over time, is you've got to not put somebody on the floor immediately. And so there's a whole, like, how do you get to modularized training,
Yeah,
right? And
for
at
sure.
a process or use case level. But which also I think helps with your self-service, right? I mean, there's a
Yeah.
win-win in that to
Yeah.
be able to, what you said, which is, automate the stuff that's really automatable so that
Yeah.
people aren't spending their time on it. But I also think there's a space of most companies are like, okay, now you're done with this training, or
Yeah.
it's always there. Now go do this. And I think it's really, really critical from the engagement perspective to either partner people up, buddy them up,
Sure.
right? Do the shadowing work for 30, 60, 90 days, depending on the complexity, so that you aren't in that space of the training is the hindrance.
Well, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I guess the 2 points I would kind of add though, or modify is like, one, when you talk about the gig version of some of these jobs, your background at Lyft, it's like people have a driver's license, like there's a certain set of bars, you know how to drive from point A to point B, you don't need to learn the London streets, right? Like you can kind of plug and chug without that much training. It is interesting. I think a lot of these service jobs, like you can't put the investment into a person to train them if they're only going to work a little bit, right? Like there is, or am I not thinking about that correctly?
I think you can. I mean, and that becomes how much you've kind of modularized that training,
Yeah.
right? If
Well,
it is,
yeah, totally.
right. And so what I would look at in those instances is, look, I've got a peak that's happening, right?
Yeah.
Maybe during the day, I've got a couple or whatever that looks like. I may have a day of the week peak. I may have all those things. And so there's a layer that I need to bring in based on kind of volume and capacity. And so I think you can look at that to say there's a range of problems that are happening within that.
Yes. No,
There's a
I
lower tier that doesn't need that much training or can be done in a different way. So I think the other space you'll find is it's not going to a well and picking up a case.
Yeah, of course.
Or doing that. It is, I am like farming this to you specifically.
Of course.
Based on your training and your capabilities, and that you can expand that or not over time.
Yeah. And I will say that, when we kind of started moving and working on Fin Analytics, there was actually 3 problems that we were really interested in, we thought were generalizable about kind of the service space. One was task routing, which is what you're talking about, which is like, who should do what task based on availability, based on skills, based on performance, based on all of these, criteria. It's almost like the work rank. If instead of newsfeed ranking stories to read, you rank what should you work on next. There was what we're doing, which is the analytics component, which is how do you have the data layer necessary to do a lot of the accountability and the efficiency driving and things like that. And then there was, to your point, the modularized workflow, right? Like, as how do you kind of modularize stuff? I will tell you kind of my assessment, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree with this in terms of how this will happen and roll out, is the data is generally a platform value that you need for a bunch of things and like has the most immediate value and payoff in a lot of ways. The routing is great, but requires the data and other changes to really make it work, right? It's like a deeper change to how you operate. And the modularized workflows and like the just-in-time training and all that type of stuff people talk about is incredibly cool, but it's extremely difficult to do. I think, right? From especially in a generalized platform way, versus companies kind of doing it for like individually.
Yeah, and I think you can separate. I agree with your layout of the 3 phases of it. I think on the training side, part of it becomes we have one size fits all. To how we look at every use case. And so I think you've got to like really categorize work, right? And there's this whole grouping of work that I think is actually aligned more with your self-help, right? So the same people that are doing your content for your customers, your self-help, your automation, those product teams should be deep in that work, trying to get it out of your front line, right? And automate it. And then I think the rest of the work is a complexity mix that you could get at, where you could look at different uses, right? In our world at Lyft, maybe driver, passenger, and there's lost this or lost that for both of them that one person can do versus thinking about that as a single work stream to train on.
Fair enough. I agree with all that.
Yeah.
Well, we've been going for a while. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we should cover before closing this up. We've obviously covered a ton of different ground. We talked about culture and morale and like the impact on that. I'm just looking kind of like through our little notes here. We talked a little about continuous improvement. I don't know. Is there anything in your mind you think is also like when you think about your experience, which is extensive, and where we're going in the future, and especially how kind of high growth or the next generation of companies are going to manage, basically people and their relationships with vendors? Like, is there anything you think we haven't talked about that's like super important to call out?
I think I'd still highlight the transparency piece. I think is just so critical, and transparency for your partners and for your internal partners, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think being able to make that connection and show that data at the detailed level that Finn brings to the table is critical to keep that connection and keep that continuous improvement happening.
Yeah.
And, I think the way everything's laying out now, especially with COVID and all the different changes that are happening, I think most companies are going to have a conscious design, think about this versus a natural evolution of things. And so I think you'll start to see companies really design this in the way that you and I are talking about, which I think will pull more up and to the right in this space.
Yeah. I guess like the last thing I just comes to mind, and just as I'm mulling in my head things I would want to call out is, I think we talked a little bit about how transparency and honesty and like kind of all comes in. And I do think it's interesting, like expectation setting and resetting also.
Yep.
Like one of the good examples is like when you hire someone for 8 hours a day, right? Let's pretend you're in a traditional world. What yield of productive time do you think you're getting? And what do you expect, right?
Yep.
And like the interesting thing is like, I remember when we started working on Finn and working on a bunch of companies, I was always very shocked at how low the yield was on average, right? And then even like for the top performers, what the yield was. And I think a lot of companies have unrealistic expectations about certain things of their alignment people.
Yep. It's
and
easy
like,
to do that.
And then the line people are super worried because the line people are like, man, I know the expectation is blank, but that's completely unsustainable. And so that gap creates this lack of trust and also like this angst about things. Whereas like once you're just like, look, like work hard, like we'll see what that looks like and we'll talk about what reality is, and you have a more realistic grounded view of how things actually work.
Well, it's the same. You can't do it from a conference room. And I think many times we sit in a conference room and say, oh, I'm going to just do this equation and X plus Y, that equals this. And so that's where the productivity needs to be. And then we don't invest in what it takes to move from where we are to where that is.
Yeah.
And so we just expect it, and you beat people tops down versus going to them and collaborating for how to get to that. And I think the great companies, the companies that'll get through this, will use their operations teams to collaborate on how do we move from here to here versus just coming in with I'm going to beat you up over this until you hit this number.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think that's a great place to end, which is don't design this stuff purely in a conference room, but also like be aware that if you're doing it bottoms up, you have to look at the big picture and not miss the forest from the trees, which is so easy to do based on anecdotal experience. Mary, thank you. I always really appreciate time with you and your perspective and you being willing to share with us. I know there's a lot of people who dialed in who have very practical questions and concerns about how to kind of do a bunch of these types of deployments and do the next generation of service folks. So thank you for taking the time this morning.
No, I appreciate it. I love chatting. You know that. So
hope that
helps others. And like I said, I really appreciate all the focus that Finn has done to enable the future of work. So thank you.
Mary, thank you. Bye, everyone.